of modern technology, we move on to the next one. So, good morning everyone. I'm James Williams from Joint Nature Conservation Committee. In previous life I have been the UK National Reference Centre and led on the work for the European Topic Centre for Biological Diversity, so working for Joint Nature Conservation Committee. So, been involved in some of the EEA work over a period of years, including being involved in helping to develop some of the EU's biodiversity indicators. But today I want to concentrate on the UK ones. This is very much looking at how do we measure progress with UK level targets, although we don't have UK targets. I mean, Martin mentioned just now about not having a UK State Environment Report, that the government isn't keen on UK level targets. But we have signed up to a whole load of things at a global level through the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity, which was agreed at the 10th Conference of Parties of the Convention on Biological Diversity. So this is a piece of work that we've been doing since 2007. We've been publishing the indicators annually since 2007. The observant among you will see that there isn't a 2008 publication there. That's because we did it on the web only. And I would emphasise a couple of things. Firstly, that this is a work in progress and has been for a number of years. We reviewed the indicators when we moved from 2010 targets to the strategic plan, which looks towards 2020, and I've no doubt that we will need to review further when we get closer to 2020 and see what's happening beyond there, picking up on Sue's point about there being all sorts of things going wrong with the world. We're not going to fix them all by 2020. We can make some progress, but there's going to need to be work going on beyond that. And the other thing that I particularly want to stress to start off with is that this is a set of official government statistics. And what that means is that we have to be compliant with code of practice for official statistics, which means no government interference. So when we've agreed a set of indicators, we go away and produce them. It's not a case of going and consulting policy whether they like what it's saying or not. This is actually going and producing stuff to say, this is how it is. Is the policy working? So the latest publication was on the 4th of December last year, and we'll be working towards another publication probably middle of December 2015. We haven't quite set the date on that yet. We've currently got 24 indicators, 47 measures. Some of the indicators contain more than one measure, and we'll come on to a little bit more detail about that in a moment or two. And I said we were still under development. We published a number of new things this last year. And I'll run through the indicators as a whole later in the talk. But I want to just give you a bit about governance to start off with, because I say these are official statistics. That's important. It's actually got a very senior governance level group right at the top of the tree. The 4 countries group is probably about grade 3, I suppose, civil servants, which is about 4 or 5 grades above where Martin and I are. And they are very much are setting the direction of travel for the individual country strategies. They get advice and pass down decisions to an indicator steering group, which has representation from all of the devolved administrations, from the country agencies, and also from the NGOs. And of course, in order to actually deliver something, you need a small project group, and that's done by people from JNCC and colleagues in DEFRA, particularly. Martin mentioned Christine Holleran in his talk just now. She's going to be presenting this tomorrow. She's the responsible statistician within DEFRA, and her team is responsible for making sure that this does comply with the code of practice. But we've also got an indicators forum meeting. It's been a bit of ad hoc. It's sometimes every year and sometimes there's a little bit of a gap. But the idea is that that's where we can bring in more of a review to try and make sure that the indicators are fit for purpose. And that's important in terms of developing some of these indicators. Some of it's not straightforward in terms of what is it that you actually want to put into an indicator. Sometimes it's we've got lots of data and we need to work out what's the best data to use. Sometimes it's what data have we got? And some of that's very much about, well, what questions are you trying to answer before you actually try and say, well, we've got this data, can we produce an indicator out of it? So I mentioned the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity. That is a global framework for all of the biodiversity conventions. And it's important to recognise that, because all of those, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, the Convention on Migratory Species, CBD, the International Plant Genetic Resources Convention Treaty, those are all working towards the same set of things. And that's important in terms of actually having a straight direction rather than everybody trying to do slightly different things. It's within a 2050 vision, but there's also a set of 20 targets under 5 strategic goals. I'm not going to try and give you the detail of the individual targets. Those are later slides if you want to see them later on, or they're available on the net on the CBD website. And I think it would be fair to say that the individual targets look like a bit of a mishmash, because they were, as with many of these international things, negotiated by committee late at night. However, if you take a step backwards and you look at what are the goals about and what are the individual targets about, then they are very much a coherent set of things in terms of trying to look at how do we mainstream things, how do we deal with the pressures on biodiversity, how do we safeguard what we've still got, how do we make sure that we're gaining the benefits for humankind out of biodiversity, and what do we need to do in terms of knowledge and capacity building in order to make sure that we are dealing with those issues. And there's an underpinning framework which was developed through one of the CBD processes called an ad hoc technical expert group. The UK hosted one, the indicators one, in 2011 in High Wycombe. And the idea here is these boxes are all interrelated. So pressure, state, benefits, responses. You can argue this is a variation on the pressure state response framework. You can argue it's a variation on the DIPSIA framework, which brings in drivers and impacts. The idea here is, what does a policy maker want to know? So if we are starting from the point of pressures, why are we losing biodiversity? What's the issue there? Okay, what can we show about what the state of those pressures are? So just to give an example, we've got an indicator on marine pollution. That's based upon 5 heavy metals and lindane, which is a fairly nasty organic substance. And overall, in the length of the time that we've been doing the indicator, it's gone down. Variations, obviously. We've got seabirds indicator as a state indicator, for example, also in the marine environment. And that went up initially, but has now started to go down. There are some issues there with respect to some of the seabird numbers going up was actually related to discards. Discards being seen now as being more of a problem from a fishing perspective. Reduce the discards, it will have an effect on some of the seabird numbers. If you look at marine fish supplies class, that one's very much about how many large fish are there within the sea. And this is based on research data, not on trawling data. And you can see that there's a decrease, and then actually we're starting to get a response, starting to get a bit of an increase there. And a response example, protected areas, the blue line on there is the marine protected areas, and you can see a massive increase in recent years, which is partly about putting in place special areas of conservation in the offshore environment. Some of those are absolutely huge, and also to do with having the new nature conservation marine protected areas around Scotland and marine conservation areas around England and Wales. So there's an awful lot being done with marine protected areas in the last few years. So I just want to point out, the booklet is a summary of the main information, and I'll come on to a little bit more detail on some of the stuff that we're doing in a moment. But there's an awful lot more information on the web. So each of the indicators has what we call fiche on the web with a standard set of content. So we've got lots of different indicators. We've got, for each indicator, a headline together with one or more measures. We've got a number of tabs which you can look at. If you click on the Show All tab, you get all of them together. But it's a way of trying to break the information up so that it's easier to access. We've got at least one graph, and we've got notes about that graph to give information about what it's based on, where the source of the information is. We've got an assessment for every single one, and that's both a long-term and a short-term assessment. The long-term is to do with the length of the data run. The short-term is more policy relevant, it's the latest 5 years. And we've also got an indication of where things are going in the latest year. We don't actually assess that, but it's for transparency. So the idea here is complete transparency. We've got a number of bullet points to explain what's going on with the indicator, and these are very much factual, no supposition allowed. This has to be, this is where the values are now, this is where the values were, this is how much they've gone up or down. We've got a data sheet downloadable for everyone, so if you wanted to redraw it, you wanted to reuse the data, they're there, they're available to use, do use them. And we've got information about when we last updated it and when the latest data was available, because of course the data A may lag behind, but B, we may not be able to update every indicator every year. So trying to be very clear about what is available. And just to give you a little bit more information about just how we do it, so take the fish size one that I mentioned just now. The raw data, which is really quite variable, that's actually not as variable as some of the other ones. But what we tend to try and do is to put a smooth line through that where we can, and it's the smooth trend that we assess, because we're trying to avoid being influenced too much by the variation in the data, particularly when you're looking at the short-term assessment. It's a rolling 5-year window. What we don't want to have to do is have something that's got up and then down, leading to the indicator assessment going up or down. So we do try to smooth that. I'll come on to the assessment in a bit more detail about that in a moment. And of course, we can drill down. We've got the indicator. That one relates to the red area on the graph. These are the IC squares, the International Council for the Exploration of Seas squares, and we've actually got data for some of the other areas as well. The northern North Sea was felt to be particularly relevant and particularly representative in terms of the data that's there. The others are a bit more variable and a bit more difficult to understand what we're doing. So just give me a second and I'll have a drink, slightly dry. What I want to do is quickly flick through the indicators that we've got. I'm not going to spend very much time on each of them. I just want to give you a feeling for the breadth of the stuff that's here. So we've got a new indicator we published this last year on awareness, understanding and support. That's looking at how are people's attitudes to the environment, are they taking action to try and reduce biodiversity loss. We have an indicator on conservation volunteering, people actually getting out into the environment and doing something practical. You can see there's a great big dip there for 2001. Why is that? Any guesses? Foot and mouth. It's exactly right. People couldn't get out into the countryside. They couldn't actually go out and do the sort of volunteering that they were previously doing. We've got 2 indicators under development in this area, one on mainstreaming biodiversity into decision making and one on global impacts. And there's some work that we've been doing with the University of York with the Stockholm Environment Institute on that one. Proving quite difficult. We've got to the state of being able to measure things coming in and out of the country, but turning that into an indicator, particularly looking at the biodiversity impact of that, is quite a difficult task. And then we've got another new indicator we published this year on various environmental management schemes, looking at the way in which biodiversity is being integrated into the decisions that businesses take. Obviously, they're an important impact. In terms of B, strategic goal B on pressures, the first indicator we've got is on agri-environment schemes, both for the entry-level schemes and for the higher-level schemes, looking at the way in which that is trying to make sure that the impacts of agriculture is being minimised. We've got an indicator on sustainable forestry based upon the certification schemes. We've got an indicator on sustainable fisheries based upon assessments by ICs with respect to which stocks are being fished sustainably. That one's actually a good example of an indicator that can tell both a bad and a good story. Because if you look at that, it's gone up, and in fact our assessment of that is green. It's gone up between the start point and the end point. But actually, if you look at that as well, you'll see the percentage of fish stocks which are being fished sustainably is only about 50%. That means about 50% aren't being fished sustainably. So it's actually bad news as well. And there is an issue in indicator development and indicator presentation of, are you looking at targets or are you looking at trends? And that's one of the things that we struggle with a little bit, particularly in the point of not having UK level targets. And we've got another indicator under development on climate change adaptation. We're looking at the possibility of developing something there on water stress on protected areas. For climate change impact, we don't have a direct impact indicator, and in fact there's some stuff that we may want to pick up from the work that's been done from the Streamlining European Biodiversity Indicators, but we have got something on phenology in terms of when our spring events are happening, and they have got earlier in the year by about 7 days. The interesting thing here is that there's some very old data, and then there's some more recent stuff that was produced through the phenology network. And it's actually being able to present the two against each other, which gives us that overall picture. We've got stuff on air pollution. I showed the marine pollution one just now. We've also got climate. We've got nitrogen and acidity exceedances, which is something that Kevin's interested in, of course. And we've got invasive species. You'll see that the last bar on each of those is slightly different shading. That's because it's only to 2014, so it's not a full decade on those bars. And you can see that invasive species are a massive problem. They really are a problem. And we've got a new indicator we published this year. We previously had one on water quality. Water quality work changed in order to be able to reflect how things were being done to report against the Water Framework Directive. So this is picking up now on the Water Framework Directive results. So strategic goal on safeguarding. I mentioned the protected area extent indicator, but we've also got an indicator looking at the condition of the triple SIs, the proportion that are in favourable or unfavourable recovering status. So that's looking about the effectiveness of management of the protected area network. We've got an indicator that we did have on habitat connectivity. We've taken it back to being under development status because it was based upon the stuff coming out of Countryside Survey. That's become rather out of date, and we've also had some problems with interpreting it, so we're going back to the drawing board. We've got information on the European habitats and European species, so this is the results of the reporting under the Habitats Directive for the UK, and that links across very much into information within the State of the Environment Report at a European level. And we've also got work where, if you remember the UK Biodiversity Action Plan, there were lists of species that were put together for each of the countries, and what we're looking at is what data have we got to be able to look at changing status of the combined list across all of the countries. And we've got information on abundance. We've also got information on frequency of occurrence, because not all of those species we can actually be able to produce in abundance level information. So the C4A is based on 213 species, C4B is based on 179 species, about 70 odd, which are in both of those. That's of a total of 2,800 plus species across the 4 country lists. So we've got more work to do in terms of what we do about those other ones, where we don't have either abundance data or frequency of occurrence data. And that's something that we are actively looking at. Quite a difficult thing. How do you measure things that you don't have enough information about? Birds, we do have lots of information about, and we've got 5 measures. And this is very much done in conjunction with British Terrestrial Ornithology, was protecting birds, looking at farmland birds, woodland birds, water and wetland birds, seabirds, wintering waterbirds. And the UK has a massive responsibility, particularly for seabirds and wintering waterbirds. Butterflies, as an example of insects, both looking at habitat specialists and species of the wider countryside. And we've got another one that was also based upon Countryside Survey for plants. We've again taken that one back to development. We're hoping to be able to produce something similar to the one that I showed you just now on priority species, based upon frequency of occurrence. But there's also work being done to create a new monitoring scheme for plants, and in due course we would hope to be able to have something more analogous to the birds and butterflies indicator based upon that. And similarly, we've got bats, and of course bats actually cross-relates with the indicator on European species, because all of those bats are European species themselves, so being assessed in slightly different ways. And we've also got indicators on animal and plant genetic resources. The animal one, I've got a meeting in a couple of weeks' time, no, next week even, try and see whether we can improve that one. Plant one is based upon the holdings in UK gene banks, and the unique holdings is what brings something out called the enrichment index. On benefits, we've got 3 indicators on ecosystem services. On the marine fish size, we've just recently produced this last year something on removals of greenhouse gases, linking to the National Forest Inventory, and we've also produced a new indicator looking at the status of pollinators. That's currently based upon bees, but we're looking at having a more nuanced publication this coming year, where we're going to be more hopefully bring in a wider range of pollinator species. So this will count at the moment as an experimental statistic. We didn't actually assess that one this year, but as you can see, the state of pollinators isn't good. And then moving on to strategic goal E, we've got an indicator looking at the data within the National Biodiversity Network, both in terms of the total amount of data available and also those data which are publicly accessible at a 1 kilometre scale or more, so that you actually got an idea of where you can pinpoint information to make it more useful for example, responding to planning casework. And we've also, the typical resource one, of course, is what's being spent, and there are 3 measures in that. The top graph, you can see, has got both blue and green lines. The green ones are NGO spend, and the blue ones are government spend, so we're developing that one further as we move forward. So in terms of what we've done with the HE targets, we've got a pretty good fit with them. We've got node indicators for 3 of the targets. There's argument whether we've got something to do with 15 as well. Target 16 is the Nagoya Protocol on access and benefit sharing. That was incredibly contentious as a negotiation at a global level. It's still quite contentious in terms of how it is being implemented, and we've therefore taken the view that we will not prepare an indicator until we actually know how it is going to be implemented, and therefore what we might actually be able to measure. Target 17 is about each party to CBD having a national biodiversity strategy and action plan. There's a typo in there, bother, so I corrected that one. And effectively at a yes, that's a yes/no answer. At a UK level, we've got a UK framework. Actually, we've got strategies for each of the countries, so you could argue we've got 5, but it's really more relevant at a global level. And then target 18 is about traditional knowledge and indigenous and local communities. We felt that that one's less relevant for the UK. It's a slightly difficult subject to approach. We do think that it might be something that we need to think about more with respect to the overseas territories, however, in due course. I should state that these indicators are looking at metropolitan UK and not the UK overseas territories and crown dependencies. That's a different issue in its own right. So I mentioned about undertaking assessments. We apply 1 of 4 grades to each measure, and we do that for 2 assessment periods. And we're assessing trend, we're not assessing target. I mentioned we don't have UK level targets. So in each case we're looking at, is the end of the line higher or lower than the start of the line? And we do try to make sure we use statistical techniques where that's possible. In some cases we can't, we apply a slightly crude but at least fairly efficient rule of thumb of 3% change to say is it actually improving or deteriorating. And we do it on 2 time periods. Firstly, the whole length of the data run, so from the earliest point we got to the latest one. And that's important for context because many of the, particularly the species indicators, have gone down over time. So that if you look at the long term, they've gone down. But actually if you start looking at the short term, we are starting to get responses, so you could say, okay, we're starting to get things showing little or no change, the decline is smoothed out, or we're starting to get improvements. If you only looked at the short term, then you would actually be giving a false picture because you'd be giving something that was actually too positive. And we did actually look at this when we first published the indicators in 2007, and we were actually quite concerned that we might be accused of greenwashing official statistics by actually producing just a short-term assessment. So, to give you the picture as a whole, and you look at that and you go, oh my god, there's far too much on that slide. Look at the pretty colours. That's all you need to do. Don't look at the text at all. And if I just highlight, that's goal A, and you can see that we've actually only got one that we're able to measure at the moment, because A1 and A5 were new publications this last year. We don't have enough data to be able to actually make an assessment yet. Goal B, we've actually got quite a lot of nice green stuff in there. We're actually making a big difference in terms of pressures. That's good news. We celebrate good news. It's not just about doom and gloom. But I mentioned invasive species being a nightmare. They are a nightmare. They're all red. Goal C, bit of a mixed picture. We've got quite a lot of red, particularly in the long term there. But we're starting to see some amber, some green in the short term in particular. So that's good news, and we should be trying to make sure keep doing the same stuff. It's not just about sort of new initiatives, it's actually about keeping on with the same old is actually needed in a lot of these cases. Goal D, we haven't assessed a couple of them because we've only just started doing them, but the fish size one, you saw flexing is starting to go up in the shorter term. And then goal E, we're actually doing quite a lot that's good news in terms of information and capacity building. And if you bring all of that all together and you just say, okay, how many reds, how many greens, how many ambers have we got? This is the figure that's in the UK country fish that Martin mentioned in terms of what are we showing for a state of the biodiversity environment in terms of UK progress. And the answer is we're making some progress. It's a mixed bag. It's not all good news, but it's not all bad news either. So I wanted to finish with a few challenges and a few next steps to give you an idea of where we think we're going, but also potentially to seed a little bit of discussion. So we've got some work I've already touched on in terms of filling gaps. We've decided we need to go back to the drawing board for the habitat connectivity and for the plant indicator, C2 and C7. A3 and A4, we're struggling a little bit, that's the mainstreaming and the global impacts. B3, I need to get my act together and produce something. We need to improve some presentation and or the assessment, and I've put two of the ecosystem service indicators there. We just want to be more sure that we're making a sensible assessment of those. We are doing quite a lot of work on how confident we can be with those assessments. There's a piece of work that we've published, it's available on the home website, which starts to look at a matrix of, if you look at the indicator characteristics, both in terms of the data and in terms of the way it's assessed, can we assign a high, medium, low level of confidence? And there's also some work being pulled together by DEFRA on a quality assurance panel, which is reviewing particularly the species indicators, and we'll also be picking up on some of this stuff about confidence. And there's another project that's been led by DEFRA in parallel to Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, looking at development of evidence statements, trying to make sure that we are understanding the science of what is going on, and trying to be clearer about, partly about the confidence, but partly about where the evidence of things getting better or worse actually is. There's a challenge that we've received through the National Capital Committee. They suggested that we should be producing more synoptic indicators. Quite what that means, I'm a little unsure. I challenged DEFRA's chief scientist, Ian Boyd, at a meeting last year, and I'm not quite sure I got a straight answer. I think synoptic means different things to different people, and I'd be interested to know what you all feel synoptic means. But there's also a big issue with that, and it's again an issue for you to perhaps think about. If you lump everything together and it changes, is that good or bad? GDP, anybody? And does anybody understand what GDP actually is? So if you lump everything all together for biodiversity, does everybody understand what it means? And I think there are some really big issues in that. We think that there's more that can be done to expand the use of data. I mentioned that the data underpinning all of these indicators are available on the web. It's there, use it. there's probably more that we could be doing in terms of using other data into some of the indicators that we need to develop. And there's probably quite a lot that could be done in terms of creative visualization of big data. There's lots and lots of data coming out of Earth observation at the moment, for example. How do we make best use of that? How do we integrate that together so that we actually come up with something that makes sense when you start drawing a graph? That's where I wanted to finish. Thank you very much indeed. Very happy, obviously, to answer some questions. I'll just... Okay.
So how many countries do have targets, and how close are we to having one, or how far are we?
I think it's fairly variable in terms of how many countries have targets. I think some do, but not lots. The thing is, when I say targets, I'm talking about national level targets. If you look at the England biodiversity strategy, you look at the Scottish biodiversity strategy, there are targets within those, but there aren't UK level targets. And you can't necessarily sum between those strategies because they're looking at things on a local level. I don't think we're anywhere close to having UK targets. I don't think government wants them. Is my blunt answer to that question. Anybody else?
Do you get much pressure from the public to have such indicators to countervail the government's lack of interest?
It's interesting. We have tried to look at web stats on who's looking at the indicators, and you tend to get a sort of peak when you first publish something, and then it sort of tails off very obviously. We've had quite a lot of interest in the priority species indicator, but that's partly, I think, because RSPB were very much involved in helping to develop that, and they pushed it very hard at the time that it first went public. I think that there is an interest in being able to see this is what it is without government spin, and I do think that is genuinely important. The code of practice is genuinely important. So,
I know this is, but do you have any feel for how confident you are in some of the data? Presumably there's quite a big difference in the kind of reliability of some of the data you're using compared to others.
Yes.
I imagine the third data is pretty robust. And do you build? And I guess my question is, how do you deal with that when you're sort of presenting these indicators to policymakers? And are there some that you feel a lot more confident in than others?
I quickly nip to the web. That's the one I prepared earlier.
Yes. It's a prime question.
It's fun. It wasn't actually, but
Yeah.
it's one that I could anticipate.
Yeah.
On the website, first thing I'll say is, again, we've been completely transparent. All of the publications for all of the years are there. You can go to the National Archive. We're not hiding what we've said in previous years. In terms of looking at confidence, one of the things that we've done this last year is to try and look at exactly what you're talking about, Sid. And this will be validated by this quality assurance panel, which is headed up by Ken Norris. So what we've tried to do is to look at, for each of the indicators, for the data collection side of it, do we think it's high, medium, low? For the rigor of assessment, how well are we doing it? And then bring those together. And what we've done is to use a scoring system for each of those, and then a matrix to try and bring those together. And the idea of that matrix is, if you've got low on something, it can't be better. It can't be better than low. Yeah. So what we wanted to do is to bring out where we got high for both axes. We wanted to be able to say that, but we also didn't want to be giving something as a false confidence in terms of saying, well, we're low on one, but we're high on another, therefore it's medium. Because I'm not sure that that's right.
Yeah. And a follow-up question, which you may also participate in, is, what are you going to do about the lows? Is that a case of trying to develop new indicators, or is it a case of trying to get more investment into getting data on those particular indicators? Is it time to shift the focus from some birds and butterflies?
Some of them we can do something about, some of them we can't. This point boils down to on that. Those are how we've assigned 1, 2, 3. So basically high, medium, low for each of those axes for the data collection side. And for some of those data where it's based upon statistical sampling, we can potentially improve the monitoring scheme. For some of those where it's just, this is the data that are available, for example the finance one, that is the data that is available.
Yeah.
So there's not a lot more you can do about it. Question about it.
So this confidence scoring approach is very interesting, obviously. The thing with confidence scoring systems is they tend to be rather arbitrary in the way they're constructed, and at the end of the process they leave open the question, well, what does it actually mean? What does it mean when you say high confidence? What does it mean when you say low? And clearly people will focus on the low ones, like our colleague here just did. But what does it actually mean when you say low? What you would ideally want in a measure of confidence or uncertainty is something that expresses how different the indicator might really be, whatever it is you're trying to measure that indicator. You know, if you're saying it's 66,